Welcome to Deep Dive Geography.
Today, we're taking a journey, a really fascinating one, back to ancient Egypt,
Hmm.
but maybe not the Egypt you usually hear about. We're looking at the ground beneath their feet, the river that defined them, the very geography and logistics that allowed this incredible civilization to thrive.
That's exactly it. We're moving beyond, the standard stories of pharaohs and gods, important as they are, and focusing on the physical realities. How did the Nile shape everything? Where did they get their resources?
Right. How did the landscape itself dictate where people lived, how they built those massive monuments, and how they sustained it all for, well, millennia?
Precisely. Think of this as a kind of geographical survey, an engineering report almost, on ancient Egypt.
Mm.
We want to understand the tangible foundations of their success.
Okay, so let's start with the absolute heart of it all. The Nile River. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine ancient Egypt without the Nile.
It really is. The civilization essentially is the Nile Valley. It emerges as this incredible oasis, really, in the middle of the vast deserts of northeastern Africa. Its entire existence depended on this single river.
It wasn't just a source of water then.
Oh, far more than that. It was life itself, but also the landscape it created. The Nile Valley, where the river actually flows, it's characterized by these incredibly fertile floodplains.
Like a green ribbon snaking through the desert.
Exactly like that. A narrow ribbon, sometimes just a few miles wide, nestled between these quite distinct bands of limestone hills on either side.
Okay.
And as the river flows north, it changes dramatically. It reaches the Mediterranean, north of modern Cairo, and it fans out. This is the Nile Delta.
Ah, the delta. So different from the valley.
It's completely different. Instead of that narrow ribbon,
Yeah.
you get this broad, triangular region where the river splits into multiple branches. It's built up over centuries from all the rich silt the river carries down. An incredibly fertile area.
So this journey north from the valley to the delta, that's kind of the geographical basis for Upper and Lower Egypt.
Absolutely. It defined the two lands, their characters, their resources, everything.
And just beyond that immediate green zone, that fertile strip, what was right next to it?
Well, between the floodplains and those limestone hills, you often had this band of low desert.
Still desert, but maybe not quite as harsh.
Sort of. It was arid, definitely, but it could support some scrub, maybe some game.
Mm.
But the visual contrast, between that and the lush riverbanks, it must have been incredibly stark, very immediate.
And this contrast, it was actually embedded in how they saw their world, wasn't it? The names they used?
Directly. They called the fertile river areas Kem. That literally translates to the Black Land.
Because of the dark soil.
Exactly. That rich, dark, incredibly fertile mud left by the flood, and then the deserts on either side. They were Deshret, the red lands.
Black land, red land. Simple, descriptive, powerful.
It tells you everything about their primary reality. And beyond agriculture, we have to stress the Nile's role as, well, the only real transportation artery.
The highway of ancient Egypt.
Completely. For trade, communication, moving troops, moving building materials, everything traveled on the Nile. It's impossible to overstate its importance for holding the kingdom together.
Okay, let's talk about the phenomenon that made the Black Land possible. The annual inundation. The flood. We tend to think of floods as disasters, but for Egypt, it was the opposite.
It was the absolute cornerstone of their existence.
Yeah.
A predictable, life-giving event. It wasn't chaotic. It was a cycle.
So how did it work? What was the rhythm of it?
Well, around July, the first floodwaters coming from the summer rains way south in Ethiopia would start to arrive.
Okay.
And the water level would just keep rising day by day, steadily, until pretty much the entire floodplain, all the fields, the orchards, everything was underwater.
Completely submerged.
Often several feet deep, yeah. This flooding period would typically last right through until about October.
Wow. So for months, the farmland was just gone.
Underwater. Then the waters would start to recede, slowly pulling back. And as they did, they left behind this incredible gift.
The silt, that famous black mud.
Exactly, that incredibly enriching sediment. We're talking potentially vast amounts of mineral-rich mud deposited year after year.
How much are we talking?
Well, estimates vary, but some suggest that over long periods, the accumulation could be significant, maybe adding up to, many feet of fresh, fertile soil over centuries. It was like nature providing free fertilizer every single year.
No wonder they called it the Black Land.
It was the engine of their prosperity. This constant replenishment meant they could support a huge population, build reserves, and sustain their civilization for so long. It's fundamental.
And relying on this single, massive, predictable event, It must have encouraged people to work together, right? You couldn't really manage irrigation on your own.
That's a key point. It absolutely fostered cooperation. This shared dependence on the Nile's flood cycle meant pooling resources and labor was essential.
How did they manage the water, practically speaking?
Early on, farmers were pretty ingenious. They'd dig simple trenches from the riverbank out to their fields as the water receded, guiding it.
Yeah.
They used basic tools, scoops, things like that. Later, they introduced clever devices like the sheduf.
The sheduf, what's that?
It's a kind of counterweighted lever, basically. A long pole with a bucket on one end and a weight on the other. It made it much easier to lift water from the Nile or a canal up to higher fields.
Ah, right. Extending their reach.
Exactly. And this need for collective effort, for managing the water, digging canals, maintaining banks, it deeply influenced their social structures, their politics. It pushed towards organization, towards cooperation, maybe even towards centralized authority early on.
It sounds like they needed to know when the flood was coming too. Predicting it must have been vital.
Vitally important. And they got very good at it. The Egyptian astronomer priests, they were meticulous observers.
Watching the stars.
Watching the stars, like the heliacal rising of Sirius, and keeping careful records of the river levels over years, decades, centuries. They developed calendars and systems to chart and predict the inundation with remarkable accuracy for the time.
So people could prepare, move livestock, store grain.
Exactly. It allowed for planning, for preparation. But it was also deeply religious. They had rituals, festivals celebrating the flood, happy the flood god. These Nile festivals were huge events right across all periods of Egyptian history. It shows how central the river was, culturally and spiritually, not just practically.
You mentioned the Nile as the sole transport artery. Let's dig into that a bit more. Beyond just moving grain, how critical was it for, say, administration or military logistics?
Absolutely critical. It was the communication network. Official decrees, tax collectors, messengers, all traveled by boat. It was how the state projected its power up and down the Nile Valley.
And for moving troops.
Essential. Quick deployment of soldiers to trouble spots, north or south, relied entirely on river transport. And think about resources. Things like stone, metals. They often came from specific locations, sometimes far away. The Nile made moving them feasible.
Were there particular spots along the river that were logistically challenging, natural bottlenecks?
Oh yes, the Cataracts, for example. These are areas with rapids, shallow water, rocky outcrops. They made navigation difficult, sometimes impossible for larger boats.
Like the second cataract you mentioned, near Dal Island.
Exactly, south of Aswan, where the river enters that gorge, the Belly of Stones. It was a real obstacle.
So what did they do? Did they try to engineer solutions?
They did it, especially during periods of strong central control, like the 12th dynasty. Rulers like Senusret III put a lot of effort into maintaining and improving canals around places like the Second Cataract.
Bypassing the tricky bits.
Precisely. These canals were vital for ensuring safe passage, especially for military expeditions heading south into Nubia, or for trade boats bringing back valuable goods like gold and ivory.
And they kept maintaining these.
Yes. Later pharaohs like Thutmose III are recorded reopening and improving these same canals. It shows a long-term strategic commitment to keeping that southern route open and functional. It was ongoing infrastructure maintenance, really.
It wasn't just practical goods moving on the Nile, though. You mentioned religious processions.
Yes, the gods traveled the Nile too. Sacred boats, called barks, were central to many religious festivals. Sometimes they were miniatures carried over land, but sometimes they were huge, elaborate vessels.
Like a floating temple.
Pretty much. The bark of the god Amun, called User Head Amun, Mighty Brow is Amun, was famous. During big festivals like the Opet Feast in Thebes, it would travel from the temple complex at Karnak downriver to Luxor Temple and back.
Wow.
Special landing stages and chapels were built all along the route just to greet the god's bark. And these weren't simple boats. Texts describe Amun's bark as being covered in gold, filled with shrines, cabins, even obelisks. Imagine the logistics of moving something like that.
So the river was sacred ground almost, as well as a highway.
Deeply intertwined. And it wasn't just the main channel. Especially in the delta, the different branches of the Nile were important too.
Like the waters of Re.
Yes, that was a key branch starting near Heliopolis, the ancient center of sun worship. It flowed northeast, irrigating large parts of the eastern delta.
And its name changed.
It did. When the Ramesside pharaohs moved their capital to Avaris in the delta during the 19th dynasty, that branch became known as the Waters of Avaris. Shows how important it was to the capital. Later still, it was the Waters of Horus, near El Kantara, before it finally reached the Mediterranean near Pelusium. These branches were like regional arteries, crucial for agriculture and transport within the delta itself. Hashtag tag 2. Topography and strategic resources.
Okay, let's broaden our view beyond the Nile itself. The deserts, the redlands, weren't just empty space, were they? They played a really important role.
A crucial role, absolutely, both strategically and economically. Firstly, defense. Those vast eastern and western deserts, combined with the cataracts in the south, gave Egypt a remarkable degree of natural protection.
Natural walls, basically.
Pretty much. It made large-scale invasion very difficult, especially in the early periods when the state was forming and consolidating. This isolation allowed Egyptian culture to develop its unique characteristics relatively undisturbed for long stretches.
So the desert was a barrier, but it wasn't completely impenetrable, right? There were ways through and places within it.
Exactly. And within those deserts, you have the oases. These pockets of fertility, fed by underground water sources, were incredibly important.
Like islands in the sand sea.
Perfect analogy. They were vital hubs. Some, like Siwa Oasis way out west, became famous for religious reasons. Siwa had a major oracle shrine to the god Amun.
The one Alexander the Great visited.
That's the one, known later as Jupiter Ammon. People made pilgrimages there for centuries, but others were more strategic logistically.
Like Karga Oasis.
Karga is a great example. It's quite large, located about 70-odd miles southwest of Isut in the western desert. It was known as the Outer, or Southern Oasis, and was a key stop on what they called the Oasis route.
What made Karga so significant?
Well, several things. It was a vital trade outpost, connecting Egypt to points further south and west, potentially linking into trans-Saharan trade routes. It was also an agricultural resource, produced dates, wine, grain.
Extra food security.
Yes, could supplement the Nile Valley. And they served other purposes, too. Sometimes a sanctuary for people fleeing trouble, sometimes a place of exile. Political prisoners might be sent there.
So the state invested in these remote places.
They certainly did. We know the Persian king Darius I built a temple to Amun in Karga, which was later restored. Other temples were built there too, dedicated to Egyptian gods like Isis and Osiris's family. It shows they were integrating these oases into the state's religious and administrative network.
And there are other important oases too.
Oh, yes. Baharia Oasis is another one with significant archaeological finds, like the tomb of a New Kingdom governor named Amenhotep II. It tells us these weren't just watering holes. They were governed parts of the Egyptian realm, crucial for controlling desert routes and resources.
Okay, resources. Let's talk stone.
Mm.
Building pyramids, temples, statues. They needed unbelievable amounts of stone. Where did it all come from?
They were master geologists in a practical sense. They knew exactly where to find the right types of stone for different purposes.
So what were the main ones and where were the quarries?
All right, let's break it down. Limestone was the workhorse. Easily quarried, relatively soft, good for bulk construction. The Great Pyramid, as we said, used millions of blocks of local Giza Plateau limestone, probably yellowish.
But they use finer stuff too.
Yes, for casing stones, the smooth outer layers, or for temples and tombs. They prized a fine white limestone from quarries at Tura near modern Cairo. The step pyramid at Saqqara was faced with it, and Eunice's pyramid nearby was cased in it. Transporting that high-quality stone would have been a major undertaking.
Okay, limestone. What else?
Alabaster, or more correctly, calcite. A beautiful, often translucent stone used for sarcophagi, statues, flooring, offering tables. The quarries at Hatnub, in the eastern desert, were famous for it, exploited from very early on. Mernre I, back in the 3rd Dynasty, is noted for using Hatnub resources.
Harder stones. For things that needed to last.
Definitely. Granite, especially the distinctive pink or red granite from Aswan in the south, used for obelisks, sarcophagi, statues, lining burial chambers, moving massive blocks of granite all the way from Aswan downriver to Giza or Thebes. That was a huge logistical feat.
Aswan seems key for hard stones.
It was. They also got diorite there. That's a very hard, speckled black and white igneous rock. Highly valued for statues because it was durable and took a beautiful polish.
Any other major stone types?
Porphyry is interesting. A hard purple-red stone. There were important quarries at Geldokhan in the eastern desert mountains. It became particularly popular during the Roman period, but the Egyptians knew about these sources earlier too.
It sounds like they had specific quarry sites dotted all over the place. Did they set up operations right there?
Yes, absolutely. These weren't casual undertakings. We have evidence of organized quarrying operations. You mentioned Wadi Garawi earlier.
Yeah, the dam.
Exactly, south of Cairo. That dam seems to have built specifically to help with quarrying in that area, maybe managing water for cutting or transport. And crucially, Archaeologists found the ruins of a stone-cutters settlement nearby.
So worker villages right at the
It
source.
looks like it. Specialized workforces, probably living there for extended periods, extracting the stone, maybe doing some initial shaping before it was transported. It points to a highly organized system.
Makes sense. Okay, beyond stone, what about metals? Where did they get the gold, the copper, the things they needed for tools, weapons, jewelry?
Metals were equally vital and often required expeditions into harsh desert regions or south into Nubia. Gold nub in ancient Egyptian was hugely important, symbolically and economically.
The land of Nubia is even named after it, right?
Very likely, yes. Major gold mining areas were in the eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, also around Aswan and across in the Sinai Peninsula. They had multiple sources, which was probably important for consistent supply.
And copper, essential for tools before iron became common.
Copper hemp was fundamental. The main sources were in the Sinai, particularly Wadi Megara and Serabit Okadim. These sites show evidence of mining from the Old Kingdom all the way through to the Ptolemaic period.
So thousands of years of exploitation.
Yes, indicating major state-sponsored expeditions to get it. Interestingly, they also knew about meteoritic iron, which contained copper and other metals. They called it Ba-on-Pet metal from heaven.
Wow.
And Nubia, again, was critical not just for gold, but also for copper. Fortified Egyptian outposts like Buhin, near the Second Cataract, were likely established partly to control access to these southern metal resources. Zerbit el-Qadim in Sinai was also a source for semi-precious stones like turquoise, often mined alongside copper. The 12th dynasty was particularly active there.
What about precious metals like silver and electrum?
Electrum is fascinating. It's a natural alloy of gold and silver. The Egyptians called it jam, or sometimes white gold. They prized it highly, especially in the New Kingdom, using it for things like decorating pharaohs' war helmets.
Where did they get it? Was it mined separately?
It occurs naturally with gold deposits, so likely from the same general areas. Silver, on the other hand, was actually quite rare in Egypt itself for much of its history.
More valuable than gold sometimes.
In certain early periods, perhaps yes, due to its scarcity. Later on, especially by the Third Intermediate period, silver seems to become more available. We find incredible solid silver coffins and treasure hoards like those found at Tanis in the Delta.
So where did the later silver come from? Trade.
Trade seems the most likely answer. We know Greek silver was a sought-after commodity in trade cities like Naucratis in the Delta. So Egypt likely imported significant amounts of silver to supplement its own limited resources. #3 settlement patterns and regional divisions.
Okay, we've got the river, the deserts, the resources. How did all this dictate where people actually lived? Where did they build their cities, their temples, their farms? It wasn't random, clearly.
Not at all. It was entirely driven by geography and resources. The number one principle, as we've touched on, was proximity to the Nile. You needed water for farming, drinking, and transport.
So most towns were right there in the floodplain.
Exactly. Most ordinary settlements, the places where the majority of people lived and worked, were situated within the cultivated zone, the Black Land, to maximize access to water and fertile soil.
But that causes a problem for archaeologists, right, because of the flooding.
A huge problem. Because they were built on the floodplain, many of these towns and villages have been buried under centuries of silt, damaged by high floods, or even washed away entirely, or modern towns are built right on top. It makes finding evidence of daily life quite difficult compared to other types of sites.
So where do we find well-preserved structures?
Temples and tombs. These were built for eternity, meant to last. So they were almost always strategically located outside the floodplain, on higher ground, usually the desert edge or low desert spurs.
Up above the floodwaters.
Precisely. Safe from the annual inundation, providing a stable foundation for massive stone structures. That's why we have such incredible preservation of temples and funerary monuments compared to everyday settlements.
Let's look at some specific cities. How did geography shape somewhere like, say, Alexandria? It's coastal, which is unusual for a major Egyptian capital.
Alexandria is a perfect example of strategic geographical choice, though from a later period founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. Its location, Rhodotis, on the Mediterranean coast in the western delta, was chosen very deliberately.
What was special about that spot?
It had fantastic natural harbor potential. There were two parallel limestone ridges running close to the shore. The outer ridge acted as a natural breakwater against the sea waves.
Oh.
The inner ridge protected the area behind it from the silting effects of the Nile Delta's alluvial deposits. They then built a causeway, the Heptastadium, linking the mainland to an island offshore, effectively creating two sheltered harbors. the Great Harbor to the east, Eunostus to the west.
Clever engineering?
And crucially, there was also a third harbor on Lake Mareotis, just inland, which connected via canals directly to the Nile. So Alexandria had superb access to both Mediterranean maritime trade and the Nile River system.
Best of both worlds.
Made it the ideal capital for the Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt after Alexander. It was a gateway to the world and connected to the Egyptian heartland.
What about older, more traditional capitals, like Memphis?
Memphis, near modern Cairo, became the dominant capital early on by the Third Dynasty. Its location was incredibly strategic, right at the apex of the delta, where the narrow Nile Valley starts to fan out. It controlled the connection between Upper and Lower Egypt.
And its geography influenced its layout.
Very much so. The city itself was likely spread across the floodplain, but its vast cemeteries, Saqqara, Giza, Abusir, Dashur, were all built on the high desert plateau to the west, overlooking the city. Stable ground for pyramids and tombs, safe from the flood. The Temple of Ptah, the creator god and patron of craftsmen, was central to the city, highlighting its role as a religious and administrative hub.
And Thebes, the great capital of the New Kingdom in the south.
Thebes, modern Luxor, rose to prominence later. It became a major royal residence and, crucially, the main burial place for New Kingdom pharaohs.
The Valley of the Kings.
Exactly. And again, geography dictated location. The city, the temples like Karnak and Luxor, were mostly on the east bank in the fertile zone. But the necropolis, the Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens, nobles' tombs, mortuary temples like Amenhotep III's at Kam el-Hitan was all situated on the higher, drier west bank.
Why the West Bank specifically?
Traditionally associated with the setting sun and the land of the dead. But practically, it was stable desert terrain, safe from floods. The Valley of the Kings itself is a remote, narrow canyon, chosen for its seclusion and perhaps the natural pyramid-shaped peak overlooking it, offering security for the royal tombs.
What about other important sites? Abydos. It was significant for a long time.
Abydos, north of Thebes, was immensely important, mainly for religious reasons. It was seen as the burial place of the god Osiris, head of the Osirian cult of resurrection.
So, pilgrimage site.
A major one, yes. Kings built temples and cenotaphs there throughout Egyptian history. Its enduring religious power ensured its importance as a settlement, located strategically near the Nile, but with cemeteries extending into the desert.
And places built for purely strategic reasons, like Buin down south.
Buin is a classic example of strategic geography. Located near the Second Cataract, near modern Wadi Halfa, it was settled very early, maybe Second Dynasty, as an outpost.
A border fort.
Essentially, yes. It was heavily fortified. Its position was vital for controlling the border with Nubia, managing trade, and securing access to those southern resources like gold, copper, and exotic goods. It was Egypt's strong point on a contested frontier.
Were there cities primarily focused on trade, maybe with foreigners?
Makradis in the Delta is the prime example. It was granted special status, likely by Sayyid pharaohs, as a trading enclave, particularly for Greek merchants.
A dedicated trade zone?
Sort of. Archaeology there shows evidence of Greek temples alongside Egyptian ones, extensive trade pottery, even early coin minting, and a huge scarab beetle amulet industry, suggesting it was a major hub for commercial exchange between Egypt and the ancient world. Its location on a Nile branch gave it good access.
And ancient religious centers like Heliopolis.
Heliopolis, ancient Ianu or On near Cairo, was hugely significant from the very beginning. It was a main center for the worship of the sun god Re, later Re-Atum. Many core Egyptian creation myths and theological ideas originated there. Its location in the eastern delta probably contributed to its early prominence.
Finally, what about really early sites from before unification, like Naqada?
Naqada, north of Thebes, is incredibly important for understanding pre-dynastic Egypt, roughly 4000–3000 BCE. Excavations there, especially the cemeteries with over 3,000 graves, have provided crucial insights into the culture, technology, and social structures just before the pharaohs emerged. It was clearly a major population center in its time, controlling a section of the Nile Valley.
Okay, let's talk about that fundamental division, Upper and Lower Egypt. We know Men's, or Narmer, unified them around 3150 BCE, a huge moment. But purely geographically, what defined these two regions?
Geographically, the difference was stark, as we've hinted. Upper Egypt, or Taresu, the southern land, was essentially the Nile Valley south of Memphis. It's defined by that narrow strip of fertile land hemmed in by desert cliffs. Very linear.
Constrained by the landscape.
Exactly. Lower Egypt, Kemet, the northern land, was the delta. Broad, flat, marshy in places, with multiple river branches creating a wide, fertile plain, much more open.
So a long, narrow kingdom in the south and a wide, triangular kingdom in the north.
That's a good way to picture it. And this fundamental geographical difference shaped everything, their economies, outlooks, even political structures.
How did it play out administratively, even after unification? Did they keep thinking in terms of these two lands?
Absolutely. The duality remained central. Administratively, Egypt was divided into provinces called nomes. The traditional number was 22 in Upper Egypt and 20 in Lower Egypt. This system was ancient, though standardized later.
And each nome reflected its local geography.
To a large extent, yes. Each nome had its own capital city, its own principal deity, its own local traditions, often tied to the specific character of that stretch of the river or delta region. They were ruled by powerful local officials, the nomarchs.
Nomarchs. They could be quite powerful, couldn't they? Especially in the south.
Particularly in Upper Egypt, yes. The more defined geographical units of the valley perhaps lent themselves to stronger regional power bases. We see periods where nomarchs acted almost like minor kings, controlling resources and even raising their own troops, like Anktifi of Moala, south of Thebes. Even when acknowledging a pharaoh, these southern nomarchs could wield significant local authority rooted in their control over their specific geographical nome.
And this duality is all over their symbolism, isn't it?
Constantly. You see it in royal titles like King of Upper and Lower Egypt. You see it in iconography. The souls of Nekhen, here Acropolis in the south, Narmer's hometown, representing Upper Egypt, and the souls of Pi, Buto in the delta, for Lower Egypt.
And that famous symbol of unification.
The Smataway symbol, yes. It shows the heraldic plants of the two lands, the lotus for Upper Egypt and the papyrus for Lower Egypt, being tied together around the hieroglyph for unite. It visually represents the binding of these two geographically distinct regions into one kingdom. The southern border of Upper Egypt itself was very clearly geographically defined by the first cataract at Aswan. Alfandani Island there was part of Egypt proper, but south of that was Nubia, a distinct geographical and political entity. #Tag4, the immense scale of logistical challenges.
Right, let's shift focus to the sheer doing of it. Building the pyramids, the temples, the logistics involved are just staggering, especially moving those enormous stone blocks we talked about. How did they even begin to manage that?
It's one of the enduring wonders, isn't it? The scale is almost incomprehensible today. The sheer volume of material. We mentioned the Great Pyramid, maybe 2.3 million blocks, averaging perhaps 2.5 tons each, some much, much heavier.
And not just rough blocks, right? They were often precisely cut, sometimes brought from far away.
Exactly. Like the fine Tura limestone casing for pyramids like Unis's, brought from across the river and potentially shaped with incredible precision. Or the massive granite beams inside the Great Pyramid, weighing tens of tons, brought hundreds of miles from Aswan. It required planning, organization, and manpower on an unprecedented scale.
Can we use the step pyramid at Saqqara as an early example, since it was the first big stone structure?
It's a perfect case study for the dawn of these logistical challenges. Djoser's Step Pyramid, designed by Imhotep. 6 tiers, originally over 200 feet high, a massive base.
What were the key challenges there?
Well, first, quarrying limestone on a scale never attempted before. Then transporting those blocks to the Saqqara Plateau. Then lifting them into place to build the steps, and facing the whole thing with that fine Tura limestone. Plus, building the huge enclosure wall around it, also paved with limestone. The organization required coordinating quarry workers, transport crews, builders, tool makers must have been immense, setting the template for everything that followed.
Okay, transport. We know the Nile was key. But how did they physically move stones weighing many tons from the quarry onto a boat, off the boat, and then to the building site, maybe uphill?
It involved a combination of techniques and incredible effort. We know they built ramps. Evidence for ramps exists at quarry sites and construction sites. Not just small ones, but substantial earthwork ramps, perhaps lubricated with water or wet clay to help drag heavy stones.
Dragging them on sledges.
Yes, heavy wooden sledges seem to have been the main method for overland transport. We have depictions of large statues being moved on sledges, pulled by huge teams of workers, with someone pouring liquid in front to reduce friction.
And ropes. Lots of ropes.
Masses of strong rope made from papyrus or flax. They were masters of rope making. For river transport, they built large barges. Getting the stones onto the barges was probably easiest during the inundation, when the water level was high, reaching closer to the quarries, which were often located near the river.
Using the flood to their advantage again.
Exactly. Float the barge close, lever or drag the stone on, then use the river current or sails, and large crews with oars or tow ropes to move the barge. Offloading near the construction site, then another overland drag, possibly up ramps, to the final position.
It sounds exhausting just describing it. The workforce must have been enormous. Where did all these people come from? Were they slaves?
The traditional view of slaves building the pyramids is largely inaccurate, certainly for the Old Kingdom pyramids like Giza. The evidence suggests a massive organized workforce, composed mainly of Egyptian peasants.
Peasants doing construction.
Yes, likely fulfilling a form of national service or labor tax, called the corvée. During the inundation period, when farming was impossible, large numbers of people were available and could be conscripted by the state for these major building projects.
So a highly organized, state-run system.
Absolutely. These weren't just building projects, they were national mobilization efforts. Texts describe expeditions to quarries or mines being organized almost like military campaigns, drawing on provincial militias and resources. It required incredible administration, feeding, housing, equipping thousands of workers for extended periods. They likely work in rotating teams.
So more like a temporary rotational national service than permanent slave labor.
For the pyramid builders, that seems much closer to the truth. They were housed in purpose-built villages near the sites, fed rations of bread, beer, fish, meat. It was hard work, undoubtedly dangerous, but seemingly part of their duty to the god king and the state.
Beyond just muscle power, what about engineering smarts? Were there innovations that helped them manage these challenges? Building these complex structures required more than just dragging stones around.
Oh, definitely. The precision is astounding. Look inside the pyramids, especially from the 4th dynasty onwards. You find incredibly complex internal structures, passageways, chambers, shafts, all aligned with remarkable accuracy.
And security features to protect the burial.
Yes, very sophisticated for the time. They incorporated things like massive granite portcullises, huge slabs designed to slide down and block passages. Also, blind alleys, hidden chambers, plugs of stone. It shows intricate planning, not just for construction, but for long-term security. Engineering puzzles, really.
But ultimately, the pyramids were robbed, which led to a change in strategy later on, right? With the Valley of the Kings.
Exactly. The very visibility and grandeur of the pyramids made them irresistible targets. By the New Kingdom, there was a major shift. Instead of building massive monuments above ground, they started hiding the royal tombs below ground.
In that remote valley at Thebes.
Yes, they chose a secluded desert valley dominated by that natural pyramid-shaped peak, maybe as a symbolic nod. The tombs themselves were cut deep into the limestone cliffs. No external pyramid, no mortuary temple directly attached.
Just a hidden doorway.
Initially, yes. The earliest tombs were designed to be completely concealed after burial. Later ones, in the Ramessid period, had a visible entrance carved into the rock face, but the tomb itself snaked deep underground. It was a completely different logistical approach, focused on concealment and security within the rock itself, rather than monumental display. They basically turned the mountain into the monument.
That's a fascinating adaptation. And what about reusing materials? Was that common? It seems like a smart logistical move.
Very much so, especially in later periods or after times of disruption. A classic example is Pharaoh Horemheb, who came to power after the controversial Amarna period of Akhenaten.
Akhenaten, the one who changed the religion and built a new capital.
That's him. Horemheb systematically dismantled many of Akhenaten's temples, particularly at Karnak and Amarna itself. The stones used by Akhenaten were often smaller, standardized blocks called talatats.
Easier to handle.
Maybe, but also distinctive. Horemheb's workers took thousands of these talatats, estimates run as high as 12,000, from just one area, and used them as internal fill inside the massive new pylons, the gateway towers, that he was building at Karnak.
Wow, recycling on a monumental scale.
It truly was. An incredible operation of deconstruction, transport, and reconstruction. It shows a very pragmatic approach to resources. Why quarry new stone if you have perfectly good blocks available from a monument you want to erase anyway? It saved time, labor, and transport costs. A powerful display of state control over the landscape, even over past constructions. #tag outro.
Well, this deep dive has really brought home just how fundamentally Egypt's geography shaped, well, everything. It wasn't just a place where history happened. The landscape itself was an active participant, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The Nile's predictable flood, the protective deserts, the specific locations of quarries and mines. These weren't just background details. They were the parameters within which Egyptian civilization had to operate, innovate, and organize itself.
We've seen how they placed their cities for strategic advantage, like Alexandria's harbors or Memphis's control point, and how they developed these incredible logistical systems to move resources, whether it was water through irrigation canals or massive granite blocks down the Nile.
And how they adapted over time. shifting from pyramids to hidden tombs, or pragmatically reusing materials. It shows a constant negotiation with their environment, a mastery of the logistical challenges posed by their unique geography.
It really underscores their deep understanding of their world and their remarkable ability to mobilize people and resources on a truly epic scale. They didn't just endure their geography, they harnessed it.
You could say their entire civilization was an engineering project built upon a geographical blueprint. Every temple, every canal, every nome reflects this deep connection between the people, the state, and the land itself. Their achievements were triumphs of human ingenuity working directly with, and sometimes against, the physical realities of their world.
So thinking about that incredible long-term success, that meticulous management of resources and landscape, what lessons might ancient Egypt's relationship with its geography hold for us today as we grapple with our own challenges of resource management, infrastructure, and living sustainably within our environments?